to give you a rather quick overview of some of the research that my colleagues and I have been doing on this topic over the last, actually 20 years now. Unfortunately, time keeps passing. We have, for the last 30 years or so, had an enormous amount of attention paid to young victim witnesses by a number of people in the room and many others besides, who have struggled to understand how much useful information we can get from young children in these situations. And I think we owe a debt of thanks to this little place, the McMartin Preschool, for stimulating a lot of the interest on this topic. Because it was in the context of the trials of the alleged perpetrators of abuse on many hundreds of alleged victims at this preschool that there emerged this, in retrospect, rather ridiculous debate between people who argued on the one hand that children simply could never be trusted as witnesses, and the other side, people who argued and testified that children never lied and would never be wrong about their experiences. And the obvious falseness of both of those positions was, for me at least, and I think for many of us, one of the reasons why we became interested in this topic. And I've spent the last 20 years or so focusing on issues relating to the quality of information that children can provide, and I want to summarize some of that work today. I want to, though, before I start, emphasize that in this work I have had lots of collaborators. Most of the research I'm going to describe is research that's conducted in the field involving interviews of alleged child abuse victims. So unlike people like Chuck and Steve, my research assistants are usually police officers and social workers. But it's what I describe when I say we. I really am here describing a lot of work that has been influenced and informed by a large number of people, both professionals in the field as well as academics who've contributed to this work over time. In the course of the next few minutes, what I want to do is to quickly summarize what we learned from some of the research on children's capacities, and then to talk about the structured NICHD protocol that we developed as a means of trying to take advantage of that research, and then focus on two specific problems that have been the focus of our most recent research, dealing with children who don't want to disclose abuse, and then talking about much younger alleged victims of abuse. Okay? So a fair amount that I want to cover, and so you'll appreciate that I'm going to be moving relatively fast through much of it. The research that was done by many basic researchers, often in lab situations, often in situations where children were questioned about structured, known experiences, has led us to some fairly clear understanding of some of the rules that interviewers should follow when they're questioning young children. And I don't have time to review the research on which this finding is based, but any interviewing person anywhere in the world will have heard some of these basic rules about the things you should and should not do in the course of a forensic interview. And all of these, it's important to say, are founded on a large body of developmental research. What every interviewer is taught, and anyone, literally in the last 20 years, anybody who went to a training session on forensic interviewing would have heard some of these basic rules, that you don't ask suggestive questions. You don't tell the child what happened, you ask the child what happened. You make sure that you're acting in a way that's supportive rather than coercive. You ask simple questions. You don't ask children to pretend. Of course, this is a bit of a problem if you're using dolls and you say, well, let's pretend this is Bobby and this is you. Not a good thing if you're actually trying to get a child to talk about real experiences rather than pretend ones. And of course, importantly, you should interview the child as soon as possible after the alleged incidents, because information is lost by forgetting with all of us, and it's lost more rapidly by young children than by older people. So some fundamental, basic, simple rules that have been the basis of what interviewers are told not to do. And of course, there's a parallel set of instructions that they learn about things that they should do. At the beginning of the interview, make sure that the child knows why she's here, what's your role, what's her role, how this interview is going to be conducted. You don't know what happened. If you ask questions that the child doesn't understand, they should say, I don't understand it. They should know that it's okay to say, I don't know. Don't make a guess, because you'll think I'm smarter if I give you an answer than if I say, I don't know. Make sure that the child feels that she has a sufficient degree of rapport or connection with you, so that she's comfortable to talk about what may be personal, embarrassing experiences. Give the child some practice responding to open-ended questions, which should be the primary focus of the interview. They're quite unusual questions for children to answer. Most of the time when children are asked questions, and they're asked questions a lot, they're asked testing questions. They're asked questions like, what color are Daddy's shoes? Well, Daddy knows what color his shoes are. He's not really trying to find out from you what color they are. He's testing whether you know your colors, whether you can come up with the right word. But the forensic situation is a very different one. The child is the expert. The questioner doesn't know the answer. And so it's crucially important not only that the child understand that, but also have some opportunity to practice answering these somewhat unusual questions, where I'm asking you to tell me what happened to you, and describe it in sufficient detail that I'll know what happened to you, because I don't know about it at the beginning. Okay? And to make sure that this takes place in a context where the child is given as much opportunity as possible to provide that information in response to recall questions, open-ended questions that ask about specific experienced events, not what usually happened, but what happened last Tuesday. All of these rules about what you should do and what you shouldn't do are very well grounded in the basic developmental literature. They've all been well substantiated, and crucially, they've all been integrated into the training that's given to forensic interviewers for a very long time. Any forensic interviewer who's doing this work would be able to tell you these kinds of rules. So it's rather disappointing then, when you look at the interviews they actually conduct, you find that there's a fairly substantial gap between what they know they should be doing, and indeed what they often think they're doing, and what the transcript or the videotape shows that they're actually doing. And the fact is, and this is a summary of results from studies conducted in many countries around the world, looking at interviews from the 1980s to the 20-teens. The same pattern is consistent across this period. The only thing that interviewers pretty consistently do is make some feeble attempt at rapport building. But beyond that, they violate almost every one of those basic rules. And that, of course, is quite a distressing situation. In the course of our research, we've tried to look more narrowly not only at some of these broad descriptions of the interview, but of the specific questions that interviewers use to try and get information from children about their experiences. And we find that the vast majority, that is as much as 80 to 90% of the questions, are of one of these four basic types of questions. And I've organized these four questions in a continuum here. The questions at the top are the most desirable ones. They're the most open-ended, they're recall-based questions, and we have lots of evidence that they are most likely to give you more information, and that that information is more likely to be accurate two good reasons to ask them. Directive questions are also recall-based. They ask for narrower, more focused information, so they tend not to produce as much information, but it's information that tends to be accurate. And as you move down to the bottom part of this list, you move to questions that are risky. They're risky because they have a higher risk of eliciting inaccurate information, and that's worst with the questions at the bottom, the suggestive questions, which not only raise the topic or focus, but even tell the child what answer you expect the child to give. Not much surprise that those questions often elicit inaccurate, acquiescive responses on the part of children. We've conducted, and others have conducted, many studies looking at the types of questions that are asked of children. And a depressing reality in each of those studies is that interviewers regularly say, oh yeah, I always ask open-ended questions. And what we find is that there are very few of those questions, and most of the interview comprises option-posing questions with the odd suggestive question thrown in, and maybe one or two invitation or directive questions. The fundamental problem is that interviewers tend not to follow these rules, even though they know the rules, even though they think they're following them. And in retrospect, that's perhaps less of a surprise to us than it might have seemed. Because what most training programs have tried to do is teach general principles to interviewers. And it's often very difficult to translate a general principle into an actual behavior, a specific question, a question that comes to the tip of your tongue when you need it in the course of interviewing a child who's describing things in ways that you hadn't expected and producing information you may not have expected. And because there seems to be so much difficulty with general principle training, my colleagues and I decided that we would take the information, the things that I summarized in those first couple of slides, and translate them into very concrete, specific guidelines that interviewers could follow when conducting interviews. And so the NICHD protocol that I'm going to talk about now is designed to help interviewers to follow the basic rules that they want to follow, that they've been told to follow, but that they have so much difficulty following. And essentially, it provides a structure for the interview, shows interviewers how you can efficiently deal with the things that you need to deal with in the appropriate sequence, so that you first go through some pre-substantive opportunities to build rapport and trust, and in the course of talking to the child and getting to know her, you let the child to practice talking about an experienced event, so that there's an opportunity for him or her to be used to that, and to get used to the types of open-ended questions that you're going to ask as you proceed with the interview. So that once the child is ready psychologically and cognitively, one can then switch to exploring the possibility that the child was being abused. And in the course of doing that, also follow a specific structure that takes you through each of the possible incidents or episodes, and in each case allows the child to provide an open-ended account of that with follow-up questions only at the end to ask about information that the child has not mentioned spontaneously that need to be obtained. We've conducted 4 field studies now, which were an attempt to see what happens if police officers are taught to use the protocol in investigative interviews. You'd be happy to know that I'm not going to talk about all 4 of them. But the basic structure in each of these is that we take a group of interviews that have been conducted by police officers or social workers who have learned to follow these specific questions, and we compare those interviews with interviews conducted of children who are similarly placed, children of the same age who are believed to have experienced the same kind of abuse by the same person, so that we can see whether the style of interviewing is associated with differences in the way the interview goes. And I'll just give you the results of one illustrative study here, which compares a sample of 50 interviews conducted following the protocol with 50 interviews conducted by the same officers right before they started using this protocol. And the key thing to note is that when they started to use the protocol, there's a big increase in the use of open-ended questions, so that the use of risky questions is reduced, although you'll see not eliminated. So they're still asking quite a few of the option posing and suggestive questions. Now, of course, these tell us only about what the interviewers are doing, what sorts of questions they're asking. It's also important to know what responses you're getting from the child. And our goal has been to try and quantify the amount of information we get from children. The important thing to note about this measure of the number of details is the fact that we only count details once, the first time they're mentioned. So when a child repeats the information later on, it's not counted again as a piece of information. And if we look at the same interviews that I talked about earlier, but now look at the responses that the children provided to these different types of questions, you see that roughly half of the information provided by these children came in response to open-ended questions when they were being, when the protocol was being used, with roughly another quarter elicited using those directive questions, and about a quarter elicited using the risky ones. So clearly, implementing and using the protocol is associated with an increase in the use of more desirable questions, an increase in the amount of information with a higher likelihood of being accurate as a result of implementing these procedures. Important to bear in mind that these data are based on essentially the first 50 or so interviews that these interviewers did after they started using the protocol. One of the facts or issues that we've been able to document is the fact that improvement continues with experience. That is, interviewers continue to do better and better interviews. That is, interviews with more open-ended questions and fewer risky questions, provided they have the opportunity to review their interviews with peers and experts, to sit down and to say, I wish I hadn't asked that question. I should have said this. Maybe I should have explored this. I might have done this in a different way. Unfortunately, very few agencies do that as a matter of course, and so you don't see improvements in quality. But fortunately, we've worked with one site where they have done that. And I want to show you this is the anatomy of interviews done in our most recent study. This is a summary from 100 interviews of children, average age of about 6. What you see here in these 100 interviews, that 60% of the questions now are open-ended invitations. Roughly another 35% are these directive questions, and around 10% are option posing. So a continued shift in the dynamics to eliminate completely all the suggestive questions, not a single suggestive question in 100 interviews, not selected for anything other than that they were a consecutive sample. And if you look at the children's responses in those 100 interviews, you get this, what I see as a wonderful set of data. More than 80% of the information provided by these children coming in response to open-ended questions, almost all of the rest coming in response to directive questions. So in answer to the basic fundamental question, yes, you can use open-ended questions. And yes, you can get information from young children using those questions, provided you do so in the systematic, structured way that we've been trying to operationalize and implement. But there's an important caveat. All of the results that I've talked about so far come from the analysis of interviews with children who are essentially willing witnesses. Children who have, by and large, experienced abuse and are ready to talk about abuse. And a criticism that I have heard for 20 years is that, well, of course, that doesn't deal with the children who, quote, aren't ready to talk. And so I want to talk a little bit about that category, the children who are suspected victims of abuse but may not be willing to describe the abuse when they're questioned. It's a fairly substantial number of children who don't disclose abuse when they're questioned. These data are summaries of data from all the national statistics from the State of Israel over 5 or 6 years. What they show is that about 70% of the children who are suspected victims of sexual abuse make an allegation when questioned, and that the number is significantly smaller in the case of suspected physical abuse. You get an interesting sense of the one of the other factors associated with non-disclosure or non-allegation if you look at the different age groups. I think people are often unaware of just how dramatic these age differences are, with fewer than half of the 3 to 6 year olds who are suspected of abuse making allegations, as opposed to 3/4 of the older children. Most people, including most police officers, think it's the reverse is the case, and that it's older children who will be failing to make disclosures. Now, I just used the D word. Let me clarify. We're talking here about allegation rates. These children make allegations. Some of those allegations are false. These children don't make allegations. Some of those children are not abused, and so the failure to make an allegation is an accurate account of what happened to them. But some of those, an unknown proportion, are probably victims who are not willing to talk about the abuse in the interview. And our focus in the last few years has been on that subset. And of course, the challenge here is to navigate this very tricky terrain. On the one hand, we want to find a way to make it possible for a victim who is reluctant to talk about abuse to actually do that, but to do that in a way that doesn't encourage false allegations from people who haven't been abused. And that, of course, is a very difficult issue that we've been trying to navigate, and I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about two studies here that ask this fundamental question: can you tell when a child is going to be reluctant? And what do you do with the information when you see that you're interviewing a child who's unwilling to talk about the abuse? And I'll start off by talking about a study of 100 children, and you can see the basic descriptors here, so averaging about 9 years of age, victims of both sexual and physical abuse. 50 of them made a disclosure in the forensic interview, and 50 of them didn't. The important thing about this study is that in all 100 cases, there was independent evidence showing that the children had been abused. So this is a study of abused children where we can then distinguish between those who were abused yet chose not to talk about it. And our focus here was on the dynamics of the interaction between the interviewers in the first part of that interview. And I'm going to run through several of these slides quite quickly, starting at the very beginning during the rapport building phase. Key thing to notice is that even at the very beginning of the interview, during the rapport building, the non-disclosures are less cooperative. They're not engaging in this process with the same degree of commitment as the children who later come to be supportive. And as you move on to the narrative training period, you see that those children are, again, but increasingly, less cooperative in their participation. But importantly, look at what's happening on the part of the interviewers. The interviewers are starting to become more coercive and to put more pressure on those children. They're not providing more support, they're providing more pressure. And by the third stage, during the time when there's the opportunity for the child to start talking about the possibility of abuse, you see that that has crystallized even further. The children even more resistant, and the adults even more coercive. So what you see happening here is a situation in which you have a child who's not ready to talk and is signaling a reluctance to engage in this interchange with the interviewer. A signal that I think is a signal, let's go slow about this, I'm not sure I'm ready to talk to you. And it's being read as, you're not cooperating, kid. You need to get with the program and start doing what we want to do. So instead of providing the child with support, they're instead providing coercive responses. And that led us to design an intervention which was focused on having interviewers more sensitive to signs of reluctance on the part of children, and teach them to be more supportive in the course of the program. And for the reasons that I described earlier, the crucial issue here was to be sure that they were providing more support without being more suggestive. That when they provided supportive responses, it was in relation to the child and the child's efforts, rather than focused on the contents of what children said. A very difficult challenge as we sought to try and teach interviewers to adopt these kinds of strategies. And we altered some of the structure as well in order to increase the likelihood that what would happen in the pre-substantive period was that there would be more opportunity for these kids to settle down, to feel more comfortable, to feel that they could count on, trust this person who was asking them about these relatively intimate things. And we've been, and then to continue through the substantive part, if the child made a disclosure, to be sure that the interviewer remained supportive, remained empathic, but again avoided any kinds of responses that could be viewed as suggestive or likely to elicit inaccurate information from the children. The attempt to study it involved comparing these 1,400 interviews, several hundred of them conducted using this revised protocol, the others using the standard protocol that I've described to you. Many of them alleged victims of physical abuse. We chose to focus on intrafamilial suspects because we know that's the group where there is the highest level of non-disclosure of experienced abuse. So we wanted to increase the targeted focus of the study. You'll see that not all of the cases here were independently corroborated. Some of them were, and we distinguished between those that were corroborated and those that were not. in the analyses that I briefly described to you. If we simply look at the rates of disclosure by children in these situations, you see that overall there was a small but significant increase in the proportion of children who made a disclosure in circumstance. It's an increase of about 10%, which is both quite small, but also quite remarkable, given that we were simply changing the dynamics of a 7 or 8 minute portion of an interview. So simply the changed focus on the children's feelings during this period seemed to elicit more disclosures. And if we focus specifically on the subset of cases where there was evidence to support the allegations that these children were abused, you see that the increased rate of allegation is even greater. So that we feel some degree of comfort that what we've been able to do is to increase the rates of true allegations from children who have been abused. If you look at the different subsets, you see that the use of this revised protocol seems to work a little bit more effectively with some groups than others, particularly effective with preschoolers and with girls in the case of sexual abuse. And if we look at the larger sample of physical abuse, you can see the subsets where it seems to be especially significant. But the key finding that I want to emphasize is that it does seem possible to do an interview that is empathic and non-suggestive, that when you do that, and I haven't presented the data here, but we've looked closely at the dynamics of those interviews, and you see that there really is a change in the children's reactions as a result of the change in the behavior of the interviewers, who are now not being coercive, but are being more responsive to the children's feelings. And if we look at in those cases where there were disclosures, there's a dramatic difference in what was the interviewer question that led the child to make an allegation. You see that in the revised protocol, it's much less likely to come in response to a coercive or confrontational question, whereas it's more likely to come in either spontaneously or in response to an open-ended question. So from my point of view, this has been a useful strategy in trying to focus on this very difficult subgroup of cases where intervention can't take place because the child is not willing to make disclosure. So now I want to switch to another group that are often seen as special problems. I've talked now about kids who are reluctant to describe abuse. Now I want to talk about very young children. Because when I started doing this work and talking about asking open-ended questions, I was told by every developmentalist, it's a great idea, but little kids can't respond to open-ended questions. And there are books, I won't mention any names, by people who flatly say that children of 6 and under can't respond to open-ended questions. For me, that's a little bit like a red rag to a bull, blue rag to a lamb. And so I've been really interested in trying to explore to what extent it really is true. Are there differences in the utility of these questions? I'll briefly describe just 2 studies here. First was one that compared the responses of 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds to different types of questions in the courses of forensic interviews. So again, all field interviews. And I'll first off just compare the averages for the 4-year-olds and the 8-year-olds. And there are really only 2 things to to emphasize about this slide, which compares those 4 and 8-year-olds. First thing to notice was with both the 4-year-olds and the 8-year-olds, roughly half of the information comes in response to open-ended questions. So even these little guys are able to respond to open-ended questions. You just have to ask them. The other important thing to note is the average number of details. 4-year-olds give many fewer details than 8-year-olds. Not a great surprise. We've got lots of evidence that there are age increases in the amount of information that people remember. But of course, that may be part of the problem. That's why interviewers don't like asking open-ended questions of little children, because the answers you get tend to be much briefer than you would get with older children. And that's clear if you look at the average number of details that these children provided in response to open-ended questions. I'm really proud of this graph. It's the nicest developmental trend I have ever been able to generate in any study in the last 40 years. So I will probably keep showing this for the rest of my life. But you see this wonderful trend here, and you understand what the problem is. If you ask a 4-year-old an open-ended question, you do get a response, but it's quite a short response. Not many words, not many details. The ball is back in your court awfully fast. This guy gives you quite a long time to think about what they're saying. You really understand it quite well. It's quite rich and detailed, and so you know what to say next. And you can make a great, cued recall response. But this one, you're not quite sure you understood what those details meant. And it's so much easier to say, whoops, who's he? What do you mean by that? And of course, you've now moved out of the recall process. And one of the things that we found most valuable for our interviewers is to spend time in those review sessions, thinking about how you formulate those cued recall questions for little children so that you can get that information from them. Okay. But the basic point I want to emphasize is that, yep, even 4-year-olds can respond to open-ended questions, and they can give you details in response to them. As I said, I started doing this work 20 years ago, and at that time, my operational definition of young was 4.5 or 5. And the caseloads have changed internationally. We see more and more younger children coming into the legal system, and I get asked more and more often by practitioners, what do I recommend to do with 2.5 and 3-year-olds? 2.5-year-olds, I say, don't. But it's an interesting question. What about those even younger ones? And so that was the focus of the next study, which looked at kids between the ages of 3 and 6. There are a total of 300 children in this study, spread across that age range. And I just want to summarize some of the data that study generated. If you look first of all at the age differences in whether or not the child gives you an appropriate response, that is, a response that looks as though she understood the question and she's responding to that question. She's not talking about the cow on the moon or some completely different thing. And you'll see that the 3 and 4-year-olds are more different from the older kids in their answers to invitations than in their answers to directives. There's a much greater rate of the kids not getting it in response to these open-ended questions when they're 3 years old. Another way of looking at those data is by looking at what proportion of the responses give you new information. And what you see here is that especially for the younger children, you're much more likely to get information in asking directive questions than in asking invitations. By the time you get to the oldest, the 5 and 6-year-olds, you see that that's much less of an issue. But there is quite a difference between the 3-year-olds and the others in terms of their responses that give you details. And if we then look at the average number of details, then you see, again, another very nice development occurred, don't you think? Where the little ones are really having difficulty generating many details in response to those questions. And indeed, the average is not much more than 1. So you're not getting narrative responses in the main from those 3-year-olds. Even when they are responding to those invitations, they're not rich responses. You can do a better job by asking these more focused questions. And indeed, I think that's ultimately the message of these data. Part of the problem with the 3 to 4-year-olds is keeping them on track, keeping them focused on the question that you want to be able to talk to them about, and not have them distracted or move off onto different topics. Directive questions are superior in that regard because they do specifically channel the child's attention to something that she's already talked about and ask for the next increment. Whereas the more open-ended questions place a much heavier burden on the child to actually remember what went before and to relate to it. And so I think that these data suggest that as you move younger, the incremental value of asking open-ended questions declines. And that we do know that if you are going to ask open-ended questions, invitations of children of 4 and 3 years, they'd better be cued invitations, ones that really keep the child's attention drawn back to the focus. And in many cases, using these other record-based questions may be more productive. So let me summarize, and then you can ask me questions about these issues. The key thing I wanted to leave you with are some basic conclusions. I think it's pretty clear that children as young as 3, and certainly children as young as 4, can be reliable witnesses. Whether or not they're reliable, whether or not they give us useful information, depends on the way in which we go about eliciting that information. The free recall questions may not be as effective for very young children, but it is important for interviewers to avoid asking the more risky types of questions. Because ultimately, whether or not you get useful information from children is partly a function of the child and the child's capacities, but it's also fundamentally a function of the capacities of the interviewer. How the interviewer organizes and frames the interview fundamentally determines how much useful information you get. And that's important in relation not only to the cognitive issues that affect the riskiness of questions, but also to the socio-emotional factors that determine whether or not the child feels adequately supported and confident that this is a situation in which she can talk about their experiences. So, thank you very much.